Right then, Sam. The first thing I do have to explain, because people seem to think I'm also a medium, but I'm not. I'm just the storyteller, just the witness, and just the scribe. Because some people had asked whether I do readings, and of course, no, I don't. I can't. However, I also wanted to explain about how the White Witch came about. It was when I lived in Freshwater, and we were having evening meetings, and when Robin was the channel, and I used to have about 12 people come and listen. And two of the people hadn't turned up, and they were definitely coming. So I thought, well, I'll just walk up the road a little way and see if they're coming. And I wandered up the road, and there they were. And Sue suddenly said, "Oh, here comes the West White Witch." And that has stuck with me ever since. So that is why I am the White Witch. However, the word witch means something to me. What it means is a wise woman or a wise man. It's because you've accumulated knowledge and wisdom, and you are then what pagans would call a witch. I don't do ritual, but I can remember being told that information is the craft. So the more information you accumulate, the greater your craft. So I thought I'd just get that straight to start off with. The next thing I want to speak about is Mary Anning. Mary Anning was Margo's guide, and I have a little bit about her in here. This is a book that I wrote with Margo on the crop circles and UFOs. It's just a little, it was written in 1991. And Margo wrote a little bit about Mary Anning. And she said, this is Margo's words, "It was way back in 1950s. Walter and I were on a lonely beach in South Africa when I discovered a large bleached skull, complete with teeth of some creature I did not recognise. We took this to the museum at Cape Town, where it was identified as a bottle-nosed dolphin, which was rarely seen in southern waters. We were asked to return to the lonely beach to find the rest of the skeleton, as it was important to the curator, a Dr. Barnard. Over several weeks we found most of it, and this was wired together by the museum staff and placed on show in the whale gallery. The local newspapers reported the find, and later it was tabled in Parliament. Many years later, as my psychic powers grew stronger, a spirit voice spoke to me, telling me she was Mary Anning and had joined me in the 1950s, influencing me to find the skeleton of the dolphin. Walter did some research and found she had lived in the last century at Lyme Regis, discovering many large fossilised creatures, such as the ichthyosaurus. We visited Lyme and saw some of the familiar fossils and a photograph of the ichthyosaurus, which is very similar to the newspaper photograph of the dolphin skeleton I found. So that was who Mary Anning was, and I do have a few more notes about her later on. And she is the person who could look into the reflective lake, or most people would call the Akashic records, I suppose, and she would look into the reflective lake and she would see scenes of the person's life that she was speaking about. And so we had many, many incarnation evenings at the Grove, which was my home then. And we'd have about 6 to 12 people. Mary Anning would come through Margo, or come to visit Margo, and then she would tell the life stories of various people who came. We all found this very interesting, and people used to queue up to come. So that was a little bit about Mary Anning. Now, I have here a little bit about who I am that was written in another book that I wrote, which is called Words in Transformation, and this is about my work with one of the other oracles, Robin Wells. And he and Mary Madison, who was the third oracle, who is Irish and lives in West Cork, they were sitting one evening for channeling in Mary's house, and I was sitting on the island, just quietly tuning in, and this is what came through. And I didn't know until I was transcribing the words afterwards. The Lady Carolyn that sits so gently with you this evening is the transcender of information. She transmutes this into the written word. She does it so well with beauty and love and care, and she rejoices in the words and sounds that are created by the verses. We rejoice, my child, with the work that you provide. It is like butterflies of rainbows flying out into the universe when we hear your rejoicing with the love and compassion that these words offer you and those around you. The two, Robin and Mary, that sit here are the workers. They are like the worker bees in the hive. They go out and get and gather and transcend. The mother that sits, she is like the queen bee. She gathers that information and holds it tight to her and allows it to transcend into other formats. That is your job, dear lady. So I was told then that indeed is my job, so that's what I'm doing now. And I thought I would start. I've made a list this time so that I know what I'm talking about. And I thought I would start with, this is one of the ones, this came after Charity, who I mentioned last time. And I found it very interesting, and I thought I would read it to you. This is someone called Thomas Jackson, and he came through in June 1978. Such an achievement I had not thought possible. To know my voice will be heard and consequently put into writing. My intelligence being normal, my knowledge increased during a long resting period. My thoughts entrenched into my deeper self. It was with a sense of trepidation that on behalf of the city mission, I went into the rookeries and squalid dwellings to dwell among thieves, cut-purses, and other criminals. It was the young children that were my concern. Another ragged school the city was opening for children who had no parents, or whose parents were of the criminal class. God had seen fit to place me among these unfortunate souls. I cannot vouch my voice reaches you clearly, but I sincerely hope it does, as I have much to say. I learnt to live with no amenities, to accept filth and vermin, and to see poverty beyond human endurance. I was accepted by these people as I showed no fear of them, yet at first I was terrified. I found the children in such a pathetic state. Some slept beneath an old sack, nestled against each other for warmth, with scarcely any clothing, and feet that had ne'er seen a boot or stocking. Others lived with their parents, who were often in jail, and when home were rarely sober. Others were sent off to steal, that they learnt at an early age, and 3-year-olds were sent off to beg. To collect these pathetic children and try to teach them the rudiments of reading, writing, and the scriptures was a task that became a pleasure. To help these young souls on a more honest way of living made me, in a humble way, feel I served God. My name is Jackson, a name which many thieves would think of as a friendly one. That was the ambition which I realised. I felt a certain indignation when I heard people saying what they thought should be done with these poor people. How could they lead honest lives with no one to help them or teach them? I experienced moments of extreme anger when one man said all should hang. Was not our Lord Jesus Christ crucified with thieves as his companions? I told an old friend who expressed his surprise I should not only work among them but desire to do so. Some of the ragged schools were opened by charitable-minded men who possessed the means to help the poor. Many were distressed that the children were so badly behaved and used foul language. What else could one expect? By 1835 there were many such schools. Always I was happy at the City Mission in London. Other missions were opening schools in other parts of the country. Oh, the plight of these verminous, filthy children, some covered in sores and showing marks of violence received from those who had given birth to these strays of humanity. All creatures are God's children, even these unwanted beings. The incredible foolishness of men condemning these children and their parents, if they had any, left me with a devout hope that in time I should convince the right person more should be done. Some of the children were quicker to learn than others. Many called me Uncle Tom. This way I felt I could reach out to them and become nearer in a spiritual way. I was a patient man, and in time the right man showed an interest. The difficulty I have to speak now is through a mist descending. The outcome of this meeting with the gentleman I shall reveal later. It was arranged that a member of Parliament would visit this part of London that was neglected, shunned, and treated as if it did not exist. The gentleman was a reformer, and like me wanted the poor among us to have an easier time. I got together a motley collection of humanity for the meeting, from a young boy of 12 to an old beggar in his 70s, also 2 notorious thieves. I was overjoyed when he arrived. The 7th Earl was such a pleasant man. When I addressed him as my lord, he insisted I called him Ashley, and he would address me as Tom. That way we could be as equals together with the poor I had collected. Each man had his say, and the Earl was able to bring about a Reformation Bill in Parliament in due course. I, not a well-known man, but a servant of our Lord Jesus Christ, had, in a humble way, helped to bring the plight of the homeless, the dregs of humanity, and the needs of more schools to the ears of the right person. God's will be done. I continued work in the ragged school, trying to teach the children that foul language was not what our Lord Jesus Christ wanted us to use. The meeting between the Earl and many thieves, beggars, and likewise was an important event in my life, and the poor knew me as a friend, which was all the riches I sought, the knowledge of being trusted and loved. My journey to the next dimension was short, through a misty corridor towards a light which grew brighter and larger. Then a look into a past life, backwards. I felt I was slipping backwards. Ships were my life then. Ne'er a thought for others, apart from receiving their golden coins for a passage. A long time past, very misty. Must get a clearer look into this life. Backwards I can go. Drifted too far backwards. Ships. So far. Cannot recall. Yet I can see quite clearly myself as George Garthorne, a silversmith, a craftsman creating beautiful objects, a delight to behold. I became so proud of my work, too proud. Then one of my finest pieces to be presented to so gracious a lady. I was making these lovely objects during the 1670s and 80s. So proud, so proud. Pride goeth before destruction, I read in my Bible. Yet I was so proud of my work. I became swollen with pride. The whole of Carey Street knew. The whole of London knew. The world knew I was a craftsman, the finest, the proudest silversmith in my mind. That I learnt was wrong during my period of learning after leaving that life. And after leaving the next earthly life, I looked back to this. Now I can go on, not to silver, but to a golden light, an eternal circle, round and round, issuing forth peace and love. My pride destroyed the opportunity of reaching this before. Now round and round to the golden light, the life force of all beings. The Guildhall Library kindly researched George Garthorne and traced him to Carey Lane as a recognised plate worker in precious metals from 1674 to 1697. Many biographies of the Earl of Shaftesbury, whose name was Ashley, mention Thomas Jackson and his work for the poor and criminal classes of London's East End. And subsequently, a curious event occurred in connection with Thomas Jackson. At one time, I sat in meditation with Len Stafford, who was a retired Methodist minister, along with his wife Bina, and we all became very good friends. Len had passed before Thomas Jackson spoke to Margo, but I mentioned it to Bina, his wife, as I knew Len had attended one of the ragged schools. She invited us round one evening, and on hearing this script, Bina told us that Thomas Jackson was a distant relative of her husband's. Len was the person who told me there is no such thing as coincidence. It is the universe trying to connect with you through synchronicity. So I thought I would read that one to you because it was personal, and I had personal proof afterwards of it. Now, I'm going to speak to you a little bit more about Mary Anning, and this was about June 1979. Margo was told she would be able to sit quietly with a person, and Mary would relay glimpses into the life of that person. She tells us of gazing into the reflective lake and relays what she sees, giving dates and places, but no names. Mary has told us that it is better that we do not know the names, the reason being that people could trace their descendants to the present day and perhaps try and make contact. My own daughter, Sarah, was born in 1961 this time, and passed a spirit from her last life in 1915, aged 36. And as she had 3 children in that life, there is every possibility that those same children are still on earth today, and it might not be very acceptable if she turned up at the door and told them she was their mother. However, this is what Mary communicated on the 4th of January 1980 about my eldest daughter, Sarah. Once again, I enter into the circle of inquiring minds to tell you of the incarnations of the young lady you know as Sarah. I gaze into the reflective lake and I see back to 1881 when she was born the daughter of a wealthy barrister. She was a strong character and had a mind of her own even when young. She was sent off to a good school, but only wished to dance and sing. Her aim in life was to go on the stage. Her parents refused, but eventually she left home and her father would not receive her again. She went into the chorus at a small theatre and eventually went on to a big London stage where she became very friendly with another dancer, who is a sister in her present life. They shared a room together, a flat, they called it, and were happy in their stage careers. In 1904, Sarah did another self-willed thing. In those days, well brought up British girls rarely married coloured men, but she did, and was very happy. She had 3 children and left this life in 1915 in an accident when the train she travelled on was in a collision. That was the worst train crash that Britain has ever known. It happened it happened in 1915, and it was up near Gretna Green, and there was a troop train involved where 270 or 80 young men going off to Gallipoli were killed. Robin was one of those young men. He was telling me about it last night, and I'd forgotten this particular episode. And there were 5 trains involved in the crash, so it really was very awful. And she died then. However, death is not the end, as we well know. Now I go further backward to such a short life. She was prematurely born. Her mother, a hosiery worker, took part in the Peterloo tragedy and was injured in the massacre. Her child was born at 7 months, and that was Sarah. This is in 1819, I believe, and she only survived for 2 months. She was too weak to live. Now I checked out the Peterloo massacre, and it took place, and I didn't check this out until last night, because I've never bothered to check anything that Mary Anning said. To me, what she said was so, because everything else that Margo had done was so. So as far as I'm concerned, it was true. And so I checked out this, and apparently the Peterloo massacre took place at St. Peter's Field in Manchester, Lancashire, England, on Monday the 16th of August, 1819, the date that Mary gave. 18 people died when cavalry charged into a crowd of around 60,000 people who had gathered to demand reform of parliamentary representation. So it was lovely to see that checked out. Now further backwards to the 18th century in India. The wife of a wealthy Indian with much happiness. 3 daughters, one being her mother. In this present life, that's me. The other 2 she knows, and also 2 sons who she does not know of yet, but will meet in due course. Her husband is a man she will have great affection for. As a wealthy Indian's wife, Sarah loved jewellery and fine saris. She had many grandchildren, and 2 are related to her in this life now. I gaze deeper, back to 1603, a poor woman scratching at the soil in Ireland for food. Her husband tends the horses of a rich man, but received no money, only a shack to live in. There are many children, all dressed in rags. She is an old woman at 36 when she passed over with another baby. Then I see nothing for a long time, but the year is 1124. Sarah is now a man and earns a poor living from the soil. It is not very clear, but these are times of hunger and sorrow. And before this I see her a long way back as a Jewish woman in Jerusalem, with a good husband who is a trader in metals. She has 6 sons and 7 daughters. Their religion means much to them, and she lives to be very old, with great-grandchildren who treat her well. Now I can see no further, and I hope that Sarah lives a life of peace and love before she goes on, as I hope she will not have to reincarnate yet again. So it seems that we come back with people that we've known and who are very important to us in this lifetime. And this will be proved over and over again as I read these very personal scripts to you today. And this was Mary and my third daughter, Kate. And yet another circle sits to inquire into the incarnations of the girl you now know as Kate. She has lived many, many times. I do not know how much I can reveal, yet I see her in 1902 as a dancer on a stage in London. Back to the other sister. A young woman who had many admirers, yet who had no love for any. She lived with her friend who danced with her, and that friend is her eldest sister in this present life. She died when she was 28 of a fever which is now known as influenza, and I checked up that would have been February 1918 to April 1920, that the Spanish flu, I believe it was called, was so prevalent. And now further back, as she had a very long rest, as the daughter of rich Indians in Jaipur in India in the 1770s. I see so clearly. Her mother now was her aunt then, and the writer and her husband, that is Margo and Wally, were her parents. She wed an Indian prince in a neighbouring state and bore him 9 children, committed sati, as that was considered the right thing to do at the age of 53. And if you don't know what sati is, it's throwing yourself on your husband's funeral pyre. Because if you were of a high caste Indian, if you didn't do that, then you were thrown out of the family. It's a terrible thing, and it went on for many years. In fact, I think even into the British Raj. And so we all did, if we were in India and our husbands died before us, that was the thing. But I believe they were drugged beforehand. So she committed sati as it was the right thing to do at the age of 53. Then I see back to the previous century, born as a boy, to her present mother. Her cousin, a boy now, was her sister then in the city of York. She, or he, as she had become a physician and married a girl of the early age of 15 and bore him 6 sons. And she had a bad temper, being very house-proud. Then I see back further to 1494, a man again, a wanderer of a musical nature, a fiddler, who made many a maiden very happy. She joined a man who travelled with her, or him as it was, and they entertained the poor and the rich. The man she was with is her own father in this present life. And they both lived to a ripe old age, for she was 90 when she passed on. Now that was a very long age for that particular time. And her father, of course, was my first husband. Then back to 1200, when she was a woman in an African tribe in the southern half of Africa, a very small stature, quite naked and very wrinkled at the age of 32, after bearing 16 children. I lived in a grass hut. Oh, the starving creatures that they were. I weep as I see this. Then on again, a soldier invading Egypt, a dark man with strange eyes. This is 919. He was killed fighting. So I checked that out last night, and apparently this was the second Fatimid invasion, and it was the 5th of April, 919. I did say 919, not 1919. It was July, and it went on till July 1921, but the whole thing failed. And it was named after Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. Kate has had many lives, and these are a glimpse into some of them. Surely she will never tread this path of existence again. She may rise to greater heights. She is a lovely girl and can go far in this life if she wishes. Her guides are with her, two delightful people, a man and woman, and they look after her now and pray for her. So that was my daughter Kate, who was very much involved with Sarah Jane in the life as a dancer, and very much involved in the Indian life as well. So this just illustrates how we come back over and over again with the same people. Some we come back with who come back in a negative way to teach us lessons. And I understand, and this was told me through Robin, and it's almost as if all those who are going to incarnate together, we sit round like a boardroom table, and we decide what we're going to be and who we're going to do and the lessons we're going to teach to the ones who are coming down to earth. And many are going to be left behind to watch what we do, to how we get on. But of course, when we get here, we go through the waters of Lethe and we forget everything that we've said we're going to do. And very often we don't do what we think we're going to do. And we think it's going to be easy. But of course it's not. Being in the third dimension and being a third dimensional person is very, very difficult. So we have a contract when we come here. Whether we fulfill it is up to us, because we come to a place of free will, and very often we don't do it. However, I'm hoping I've done it, because I don't want to come back again. However, that was Sarah and Kate. I will show you those later. Where have I gone? It was revealed that Margo and I had been cousins in one of the southern states of America during the 19th century. Not much information has been given on this particular life, but we know we were women. Our names were Betsy and Susanna, and we remained unmarried as both our beaux were killed in the Civil War. Apparently, I turned to religion and looked after my cousin who lived with me. Much more information has been released about our lives before that, during the 18th century. At first, we were only given a little knowledge about this period, but gradually, as we came to accept and work for spirit, we were enlightened. We learned that Margo and I were sisters, born to very wealthy parents of the Brahmin caste. Our mother, then, was my eldest daughter now, Sarah, in this present life. We had another sister whose name we do know, but who wishes to remain anonymous. She's passed into spirit now. And two brothers who we've not met in this life. Margo's name was Valsala or Walsala. My own was Sumadara, and our other sister's was Muhini. We lived in Jaipur, a life of selfish indulgence with no thoughts for the poor and starving. We were all musically gifted and enjoyed singing and dancing. Our sister Muhini was the favourite of the Maharaja, and at 16 she went to live in his zanana, from which she was never allowed out, although Margo and I were able to visit her. As far as the two of us, we both married men to whom we are now married. Reg and Wally had been boyhood friends together and spent their lives studying the Vedas, which are the scriptures of the Hindus. The Brahmins are the highest caste in India, the priest class. And Margo bore 5 children, and Kate, one of my own daughters now, was one of hers, and her name was Sareen in that life. And to my sorrow, apparently I only had one little girl, whose name was Janaki, and she is our daughter Zoe in this lifetime. We led lives of indulgent extravagance that it's no wonder we've all had to return to the treadmill of earth, and this time in more moderate circumstances. I've just spoken about, it mentions here about committing sati, and apparently this act in itself was a sin, for we have been told so many times that God alone has the power to give and take a life, or the Creator, whatever you wish to call the God that you hold dear. So once again, we're all together to work out our group karma. There's a little bit more here about Mary Anning. Mary was born at Lyme Regis in Dorset in 1799, and as a child her interest in shells and fossils was fostered by her father, who was also a paleontologist. With him and her brother Joseph, she wandered the beaches near the Black Fen, gathering strange objects which they sold to the visitors to supplement her father's income as a carpenter. In those times, people did not do their own collecting. Mary was 11 years old when her father died, and her mother was left in very poor circumstances. The child decided that she would do as she had done with her father, search the seashore for fossils, which she was able to sell for extra money to help in the home. Joseph and Mary continued to explore the cliffs for the strange objects which were so pleasing to the visitors, and in 1810 discovered the head of a creature they believed to be a kind of crocodile protruding from the rocks, and during the next year they were able to remove the remainder of the skeleton from the rock. It was, in fact, the fossil remains of an ichthyosaurus, which can be seen today in the Natural History section of the British Museum at South Kensington. The similarity between these two findings was certainly not coincidence. Mary had indeed led Margo all those years before to that bottlenose dolphin. Margo also has a great love of stones and fossils. And the scientists of the early 19th century became aware of Mary's achievements, but she had little time for those who profited by using the knowledge they gained from her hard work in writing of books, for she herself had little reward. She is remembered today as the fossil woman of Lyme Regis, and her grave lies in the parish churchyard. Margo has visited her resting place and seen the memorial window in the church, which bears the inscription, "This window is sacred to the memory of Mary Anning of this parish, who died 19th of March, AD 1847, and is erected by the Vicar of Lyme and some of the members of the Geological Society of London in commemoration of her usefulness in furthering the science of geology, also her benevolence of heart and integrity of life." Mary made comment on this window to Margo to the effect that it was a great pity they did not do more to help her during her lifetime instead of erecting a memorial which she could not appreciate after her passing, which is quite understandable. That I have read you. That is Sarah's incarnation. Mary Anning on my incarnations. This was given on the 5th of the 10th, 1979. You have promised that you would be able to tell Carolyn of her past lives. And is she so fixed into the spiral, it gives me a lot of pleasure to tell you about her. You all know about your lives together in India and a small amount of America. Perhaps I can tell you more of that if there is time. But I shall go back further to the years between 1600 and 1630, when she was the wife of an apothecary in the city of York. She dwelt in a few rooms over and behind the shop, which was small and well stocked. Her husband was respected and in great demand for his simples, herbal cures and other remedies. Carolyn, as I shall still call her, helped him in making up physics, and she had 3 children. The girl she now calls Kate was one of her sons. She had 1 other son and a daughter. Her husband was a very conscientious worker and a man who she's not met in this life. She lived until she was 46, as then people did not live as long as they do in your day now. She never left Yorkshire and rarely left York. The shop was just under the city wall and rather dark, but very comfortable, the living quarters. I've had a glimpse into this age she was living in. She had lived several times before, and as a man in the year of 1480, I see her dark-skinned with paints of spirals shaped on her face, or should I say his face, way the other side of the world, near Australia, further on, an island. It is very hazy and I'm not too sure where. I shall find out more about this, but the spirals are so clear to me. Now back to your time, Nera. Now back to your time. She was in America. Before I read that one, I want to show you this. This is where I lived in York. It's called the Shambles. And this was a postcard that Margo sent me. And the writing says, "Dear Carolyn, having a good time sightseeing in York. Your house is here in the Shambles, so we'll tell you all about it when I see you. Love, Margo." Life in America. Well, I was the belle of many balls, apparently. In fact, you all were. It says, I was in love with a young man who was in the army, and he was killed in a famous battle in the Civil War. She did not marry, or I did not marry, but looked after my cousin and another one, and another cousin, and turned to religion. I can say no more now, but I do hope she is happy to know all this. I do like to help people. And then on the 24th of November 1979, I got a little more. The last I told you of Carolyn was a Maori man, but I see today more clearly, and she was on a Pacific island, so I shall call him a Maori. And one of the friends she has with the funny golden name was her brother in this life. Also, I see her in 1107, a Norwegian, a musician with a strange instrument at the court of the king, with much talk about war and the Crusades. Now, the lady with the funny golden name, my friend, is my friend Aurea, and the name means golden. And Aurea has been my friend since I was 19, and she is now 87 and still going strong. So we've been together many times, many lives. Carolyn has had to lead a life of helping others. Now, this was given to me in 1981 with a strong faith, because I can now see in the reflective lake a life which did not show itself before. She was a man born about 1523 who became a parson in North East England and lived about 41 years. Not a kindly man, and did not practice what he preached. He used the poor box to satisfy his greedy nature. Carolyn has had several lives since, but this is the one she pays off this particular debt. It was a life of no faith, really, just doing a job, but now her faith is there. I may see back to a more worthy life a bit earlier sometime. Among your friends, Carolyn now has a religious knowledge that surpasses anyone else. She knows she has to help. Well, I could tell you a little bit more about that life, because in those days, of course, I would have been a Catholic. It was before the time of Henry VIII and the Church of England. And the vicar was usually the third son of some lord, because the first son inherited, the second son went into the military, and the third son went into the church, in order to maintain control over the masses. So they had control everywhere. So, of course, I didn't want to go into the church. I had no faith. I wasn't particularly interested. So I, as it says, I was greedy. I used the poor box, obviously stole from the poor. And but I will tell you something. In this lifetime, I had a servant girl who was not treated kindly. In fact, I was so horrible to her that she eventually left without any recommendation and died of the cold. I learnt of this later. Now, when we came to live in Ventnor, we brought someone with us who Reg had met in Bristol, and his name was Gordon. And this man always gave me, he was always very kind to me, very courteous, but always the hackles rose on the back of my neck at times. And I thought, there's something about Gordon I do not like. And I did not know what it was. He lived with us for a long time, at various times. Well, we lived on the island, then he eventually went back to the mainland. He'd had a terrible life, as I understood later when he told me that his father sold him when he was a boy, and obviously he was a very good-looking boy. And he went to live with this man who was worked with the aristocracy. He was a horse trainer. And he was abused. So this was what I was obviously picking up, that this was the part that I didn't like, that was in his auric field. Anyway, we had a terrible accident when I lived at the Grove, when one of my boys who lived there, he was 22, he was killed down a well. And it was a very tragic time in our lives. And he was a very beautiful young man. This was the young man I think I told you about last time. And I received a bouquet of flowers from Gordon. And it just said, my thoughts and prayers are with you at this terrible time. And as I picked up those flowers, everything I had ever felt for Gordon just vanished. It was completely cleared, and I just felt a great love for him in my heart. I never knew what happened to Gordon. We tried to trace him. He went to live in Kingston-on-Thames, and I've never been able to trace him. But Gordon was the girl in that lifetime who I had abused and treated so cruelly. So our karma comes back, and we have to find it in our heart to be kind to those who we don't like. Yes, now I have nothing but love for Gordon in my heart. So that was very good knowing that later on. However, to continue. November 1982. I told you I would tell you more of Carolyn's past lives, and I can see now in the reflective lake that somewhere in the 4th century, Carolyn lived in a small village just outside Glastonbury. So she has climbed that hill before, just as you did. She was a woman in that life and studied the use of herbs and wild berries for all sorts of things, and was quite knowledgeable for those far-off days. I think she knows a man now who she met then, who employed her to tend a sick cow, and he gave her a bucket of milk and some eggs. That is so clear in the lake, but it is all I can see today. I may see more later. Lovely little tender gifts and things like that show up, and I find it so human, really. And then a long way back in very early, this was not a very good life either, very early times of Christianity, a man in Rome, a soldier at the time of throwing the Christians to the lions. At 17, he was on guard duty, guarding the Christians due to go into the arena. He came from a poor family and was very upset to see a young woman with her baby. He risked his life and job to let them out of the cage and set them free, but had to harden himself as he got older. He married and had several children. His wife died, but he never married again, but took another woman to look after the children, and she gave me 3 more. But I was never home very much. I never left Rome. I was promoted and was in charge of a lot of men. Did a lot of writing for the Legion on the administrative side. And just 6 months away from retirement, I died a natural death. I cannot stand the sight of the Colosseum. And now I know why. Then, this was a very important life. This was given in June 91. It was in ancient Egypt, the child of a servant at the court of Nefertiti. I was kept away from the queen with threats of death should I go to the royal chambers. But being self-willed, I managed it. I was taken back to the servants' quarters and beaten. But it was no good, because 2 days later I was back again. And this time the queen saw me and spoke and told me that when I was older, I could be one of her handmaidens. I was 7 or 8 at the time. By the age of 14, I was in the queen's entourage, being the servant of the person who looked after her clothes. Gradually I took over and served the queen until I died. I wasn't interested in men. I was only interested in looking after the queen, and I was 32 when I died. Now, that life is spoken about. This is my lives in ancient Lemuria and ancient Egypt at the time of Nefertiti. And it was done through crystal scrying with Mary Madison and Margo. I never saw anything in my crystal, sadly, but I heard a great deal from Margo and Mary about what they saw, and it coincided every time, and it was all about those wonderful lives spent there. Timeless encounters, crystal magic on the Isle of Wight. So I believe that's all I have on my lifetimes, and I really don't need any more, preferably. I have another daughter, and her name is Susie, and she lives in Australia. So actually I have 4 daughters, and she lives in Australia, and she was given an incarnation in 1979. There is time and power for me to step in and tell Carolyn what she would like to know. I told her of another life, and I know she has a daughter she wants to know about, as this girl was not mentioned in the Indian life at all, and nor the American life. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 incarnations to meet, but time is not important. This girl, Susie, was with her when she was living in York in the apothecary shop. She was the identical twin sister of Carolyn, but not very strong in health, so did not wed. She lived with her sister, and they were devoted to each other, and whatever one wanted, so did the other. It was a happy life, apart from ill health, and Carolyn's husband spent many days and nights concocting potions and draughts for his sister-in-law, but she passed over about 3 years before her twin, so the bond is still strong, as twins are the reflection of each other. Susie has had other lives since, but that was the last she had with Carolyn. I do hope I have helped you to know that you can do this, and Carolyn I have helped by knowing. And I have one more of Susie's. The circle sits yet again in the same room to inquire into the incarnations of the young lady named Susie. Oh, how many times has she trod the weary road of earthly life, of trials and tribulations, of birth, death and rebirth. Back I go, looking into the reflective lake where I see the wife of a fanatical sect of people in America in 1897. They are evangelists that keep within their own community. The girl, Susie, is a rebel and disgraces herself by daring to wear a pair of her husband's trousers while working in a cowshed. She is called before the elders, and she is heartbroken with their cruel remarks. I see many tears shed. She died young in her early 30s and has rested until now. But going further back to France, a very lovely, wealthy lady married happily to a count with a fine chateau near the banks of the Seine. But alas, the lovely family, with 4 small children, are doomed. As in the early 1790s, they travelled in a tumbril to the fatal guillotine. Now, I knew nothing about French history when this was given, but apparently a tumbril was the cart that they carried the victims to the guillotine, which was public. And it said, and this was during what was referred to as the Terror, 1793 to 1794, where 40,000 people killed. And martial law was instigated, and the use of the guillotine skyrocketed, and it was led by Maximilien Robespierre. And this also included, of course, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the King and Queen of France. Sad times for all. And I don't know, when is the world going to change? Then I go further back, 1600. The twin of the lady who is her mother now, she was the sickly one, and died unmarried a matter of 3 or 4 years before her twin. I'm not certain exactly, but was well loved by the family and cosseted. Now we go back to the time of Henry VIII, a world of gaiety, of mummers and music and lovely clothes. She was at court and happily flirted with one gallant courtier then another. This was her butterfly life, just a life of fun and merrymaking, and ne'er a thought for anyone. She lived to be a ripe old age and had many lovers. Bless her heart. How wonderful. She's very loyal now. Then backwards to 1630, when I see her as a native Aborigine in Australia. A man, very ugly and nearly an animal as they lived. No home, living on grubs and other insects. This was a natural life, but a hard one. Then I seem to miss by several lives, right back to ancient Egypt. A lady in the lovely palace of a pharaoh, one of his ladies of the harem, or whatever it was known by, the most perfect dancer of all, who was rewarded by many jewels and trinkets. Now, little Susie, make the most of this life before you leave. Make the most of this life you have. Now I say to her, learn and return no more, but go towards the light. Now it's very interesting that she'd had a life in Australia, but as an Aboriginal. And of course now she lives in Perth. But she's always been a good dancer. And just recently, she's been a nurse all her life in accident and emergency. And then she was made redundant. So she works on the bank now, just occasionally. But she's also very keen on deep sea diving. But her other love is dance. And she learnt belly dance some years ago, but now she has just learnt. It's a dance routine, and it's an exercise dance routine, and it's Les Mills is the man that started it, and she teaches that as well now. So it's strange how these gifts come back to us time and time again through our lives. So that was Susie. I hope you're finding this interesting.
Deeply interesting.
Now this is my husband, Reg. You are now in the circle of inquiry into the man's past that you now know as Reg. This was given in 1979. Well, already you've been told he was a high caste Indian in the class that looked down upon others. This was his material, wealthiest life. He surrounded himself with so many jewels and wonderful things of beauty, but would see little children starve rather than give a coin away. The lady you know as Carolyn was his wife then, and their child was with them in that incarnation. He did not return until now, as he needed instruction and rest before. Then I see him in a much poorer position, a rather sad wanderer, a tinker by trade. From 1615, when he was only young and orphaned, he roamed the southern and southwestern counties of England. He had a wife. He's not met her in his present life, but she died when their child was stillborn. He wandered around and died of the cold in 1649. That was why he was given a more comfortable life the next time. He had his faults and was not particularly religious, so that was why he had to learn. Before that, in 1500, I can see this cloth merchant near London Bridge. He had a small but prosperous little business and would sometimes put his prices rather high, but gave to the poor, which stood in credit for him. Before that, I see him further back. Not certain of the date, but in the 13th century, he was at sea in a large ship. He traded between Portugal and Britain. A man who was shrewd and with a love of the ladies. He had 3 wives and many women. Also one more life, 11th century Cathay, a wanderer who joined a band of men who fought bravely and well. He was killed in a fight and had been wounded before. The time he was in London as a merchant, his wife was good and merry and fed him so well he was very stout. At 43 he departed. I have now told you a little of Reg, and I hope it will help him to know of the past, and may the future hold much for him. So I'm not going to be allowed him to get very stout in this lifetime. It was interesting that he traded in a ship between Portugal and Britain, because when he was about 10 or 11 years old, he drew the Cutty Sark, which is now hanging in his bedroom upstairs, a full sailing ship, and he drew another drawing which was of a boat going down the Nile with the pyramids in the background, and he's never done any drawing since those two, and I think they had to do with his past lives, because as you will see, he had a life in Egypt as well. And then a very long way back in Africa, in the south, a bushman, very small in stature, 4 foot 4 inches, which was quite tall for the tribe. As a child he ran wild, as all children were, and ran naked. He went through forms of initiation into manhood. He bought a wife for 2 goats. He was very proud of this. He was 16 at the time and became quite good at getting cattle and goats, with which he bartered. He took another wife for 1 cow and went through a form of marriage. He finished up with 4 wives and 15 children, and was very pleased that 8 were daughters, as they would fetch more goats and cattle when you arranged marriages for them. He roamed around, and they built round houses of twigs, lived till he was 39, which was a great age for a bushman, and was revered as an elder of the tribe, and he died naturally of old age. And then, very long way back, to touch on one of the lives with Carolyn. By the way, he and I have had 5 lives together, I was told. So I think I've done it enough. A long way back, to touch on one of the lives with Carolyn, ancient Egypt at the time of Queen Nefertiti. He was an artist and did wall paintings of Isis, Horus, etc., and painted the gods on the walls of the dwellings. He had admired Carolyn for some time, but she played fast and loose, as was in quite a high position. Apparently I flirted, but he had desire for me. He also knew Margo and Mary in this life. We did eventually, after 5 years of courtship, go through a ceremony, but died soon after, working on a wall. A stone collapsed and struck you on the head and killed you, and you only lived to be 30. And apparently Nefertiti was from 1370 to 1330 BC. Continuing Regis incarnations. He was in Greece, the son of a man who had a large vineyard, and from an early age hated the smell of wine, hated the time spent treading grapes, and ran away and hid. His father took a stick to him. But he loved to see the men working with stones and building, making the temples and massive pillars. Father would drag him home by his ear. By 12 he'd given up hope of joining the wine business, and he went to learn the building trade. He did a lot of work on a building whose ruins can still be seen. He was married to a builder's daughter, and his parents were upset by this, as it caused a family disagreement. They were not happy, and she was a disappointment to him, as he hoped for many sons. After 4 years there was a sickly daughter born, but she died. 3 years later another girl, and yet another. He wanted sons, as girls were no use to him. Interesting, as they were so much so in the other life. He became interested in the politics of the day and listened at the forum. had his say, stood up and spoke. He lived a long life and he's still working up until he was 75, but became crippled when someone dropped something on his leg and he walked with a stick. He had a roving eye for other women, so he didn't get on well with his wife, and he died at 85. And then there was just one more given. He was in Peru with a friend of ours who we know in this life as Guy. And this time he was a woman, a weakling child who grew up to be very downtrodden by some man. He used to go to Guy and share his troubles, or share her troubles. Mary could see a stone building with steps leading up to it, and you were very thin and walking up these steps with offerings for the gods. You had 6 children, 4 died before 3 years old and lived to be 38. Now, I did wonder if that was Machu Picchu. I know there are many pyramids with steps in Peru, but we were never given any further information about that. This is my daughter Zoe, who is the daughter of Reg and I, who was our daughter in India. Zoe has been given her lives as a milliner in Paris in the 19th century and as an overseer of the building of the Great Wall of China. This time in Scotland, when the English and Scots were fighting each other. She was born the daughter of a chieftain, 5 brothers, and the only girl, the youngest and very spoiled. Always having jewellery made for you, very large and barbaric, with which you adorned yourself. There were many feasts at the castle in the banqueting hall, and you were allowed to join in at 11. By 13, your father had arranged a marriage with the son of another chieftain. You lived on the borders. The English advanced and crossed over and drove the Scots back, and many of your father's followers were killed. You were taken further into Scotland to a safe place by 2 of the servants. Your father and brothers were all killed and the castle ruined. You now lived in poor conditions in a hovel and rejected the kindness of the servants who looked after you. You were very bitter and there was no jewellery. By 19 you were quite pretty and several men paid you compliments. You met a young man you were reasonably fond of whose father was a merchant. You married him and lived in a cottage, a small dwelling, and had 3 children. Then he was killed and you were very upset. Another man came along and in due course you married again and had 2 more children. You lived a life of domesticity very unlike your upbringing, about which you told your children and grandchildren. You hated the English and flew into a rage if they were mentioned. You lived unto your 70s. And Mary stressed your bitterness. So obviously that is one of the things that Zoe has had to deal with in this life. Margo could see a very large circular brooch with a cairngorm in the centre, surrounded by chased pewter and small stones around the outside. This was fastened on your plaid of green and black with a thin yellow line on your shoulder. I tried to find that plaid, but I'm not quite sure which one it was. This was given in 1990. This is the incarnation before the present one. You were a milliner in... Perhaps I should have read this first. You were a milliner in Paris, France. You started work at 16 years of age in a workroom in around 1900, making hats. There were many other girls with you, but you were quicker with your hands, more skillful, and you were soon given a prominent position. You were very thrifty with money and practically lived in poverty rather than spend money. You had no interest in men, and at about 25 you started your own business, making hats with beauty and style. You had ordinary features and your main interest was making money. In this life you became a wealthy woman in a short time, since you passed over at approximately 32 years old. Zoe loves jewellery in this lifetime. She does. She actually makes it in this lifetime, which I found very interesting, as she loved jewellery in her Scottish life. So that's my youngest daughter. This is my... How long?
The camera's got 7.5 minutes left.
Oh, is that all?
But I can go back home, take the media onto the computer and empty it from there so that I can come back if we need to.
Mary Anning on Reincarnation of Katie. And yet another circle sits to inquire into the incarnations of the girl you now know as Kate. She has lived many, many times. I do not know how much I can reveal, yet I see her in 1902 as a dancer. I've read this one to you. I read this one in the beginning, so I don't need to read that particular one. I read it in the beginning after Sarah, if you remember.
Okay, well I can edit that bit out.
Yes, but there is drifting. Yes, edit this bit out.
Okay.
In 1200, no. Drifting backwards, Japan, a long time ago, 2nd or 3rd century, very faint, when a man with a horse, a young man riding, galloping through a crowd of people. He knocks several flying in an attempt to reach a sacred temple to deliver a very, very important message. You live your life as a messenger, going from temple to a palace or such like, ruthless, but a fine horseman, and uncaring who you injured or killed. Never cared about a woman or families, took women when you wanted, stabbed and killed at 28, a violent life, unlike any of your others. And then a long way back in Greece, something to do with a Greek philosopher. You were someone who did the writing for him, his amanuensis, a scribe. You were a man and had been with him since you were orphaned as a boy, very bright and interested in what he did. And you remained with him right until his death. He was very famous. You were about 35 when he died, and you married then and lived happily until you died. You carried on writing the most beautiful scrolls. Mary had a glimpse of you. You were very tall, dark-haired in a white robe. Your whole life was dedicated to keeping the work of this philosopher alive, and you were well respected in the community. You had 5 or 6 children, and one died as a baby. Well, those are the incarnations of my family. I hope you've enjoyed it. There were some more that I wanted to mention about friends who have been with me in other lifetimes and have turned up. One particular friend was May, who I met when I first came to the island, and she was a mercer in York. And a mercer is someone who dealt with very fine fabrics, and she was a friend of mine in York. So that was May. And of course Mary, I have her incarnations here. I wanted to show you a picture of Mary, but I also have I have a little book here that I really do want to share with you, and I want to read some of this to you. So this is a man I met who gave me acupuncture, and the extraordinary story that happened when he came to see Margo. This is just like a fairy story. And he actually found a photograph of who he was in his past life with the information that Mary Anning gave him.